Well, I guess the biggest thing that happened in 1989, the first local school councils were elected. 1995, um, looking back at the first half of the decade of school reform, um, and seeing not enough progress in student achievement and productivity of schools, Mayor Daley asked for and got direct political responsibility for the public schools in Chicago. And I got to give him credit for this. This is a huge change, and it's because of public demand. And it's saying you're going to stake your political career on the improvement of the public schools. The legislature gave the direct power and control over the public schools to the mayor of Chicago. Now, big city mayors all over the country want that same kind of responsibility. They've got it now in LA. They're trying to create that same kind of a relationship in New York and other cities. Why? Because what's the most important thing that voters look at if they have kids? How are the schools? How's that going to affect the quality of my life and that of my family, my kids' future options? What neighborhood do I want to live in? Depends. Does it have a decent school? It has everything to do with neighborhood redevelopment. How can you redevelop a neighborhood if it's not going to be anchored by some solid schools? So all the other investment follows it. How can you redevelop a neighborhood like Austin in the West Side, and there's not a high school in Austin where people will send their kids? Well, the banks are ready to invest millions in new housing stock in Austin, new commercial stock in Austin. But where are the new homeowners going to put their kids in school? They got to get on the bus because they're not going to Austin High School, and that's a fact. The mayor said, this situation can't go on like this any longer. We're passing kids out year after year from school with 4th grade reading levels, graduating from the 12th grade. We've got a majority of high schools in the city from which fewer than 50% of entering freshmen ever graduate. In many of them, fewer than 30% ever graduate. Dropout rates of 70 and 80%. Unacceptable. So, as the schools go, so his political fortune goes. I think that that's a pretty bold step for a politician to take. And I think it's a strategic one, and I respect it. Even though I think a lot of the decisions they've made, I wouldn't have done them the way they've been done. I think that's remarkable. And that's the biggest change, is that the mayor then brought in a team of management that he picked. They whittled down the Chicago Board of Education to people that he picked that represent political and business leaders that the mayor picked and that agree in general with his approach.
How much progress is being made?
It's an interesting question. It depends on how you measure. If all you're interested in is the single measure of standardized test scores, slow incremental progress is being made. If you're interested in improvement of schools by other measures, are more kids staying in schools, showing up at school, evidencing some engagement by virtue of participating in stuff that has to do with school, staying long enough to graduate, then they're improving. Many of our schools are improving significantly by those measures. But standardized test scores, which I think are a fundamentally flawed instrument for judging these things, not enough. And unfortunately, that's what public attention has to be focused on, and policymakers' attention is focused on it.
What's going on in our country right now that is creating that focus? That means a criteria that standardized tests are becoming the standard by which, I mean, that's the argument at the national level, is about how you measure the progress or the lack of progress in public education.
We have to measure it, and it is one way of measuring. I don't want to be misunderstood. I don't think there's anything inherently evil about giving kids a test. In Chicago, there's some kids in our high schools that are getting 12 and 13 standardized tests a year. I think that's obviously excessive. The kids' time and instructional time is largely absorbed with preparation for tests, practice tests, and yet, the results of those tests aren't aren't necessarily reflected upon, and used to change or to address stuff that kids don't know how to do.
What's going on in our country in general at this point in history that creates the debate where standardized testing is the sole measurement or sole opposition to
It's a good question. Well, one thing I think is that this started during the Cold War. This obsession with measuring progress, school against school. It's very tied in this country to property values. I live in Oak Park, and when people get the ISAT state test scores, they look at them to see how their school did compared to the other school neighborhoods, because it affects the housing market, the value of your single greatest investment for an average middle-class family. That's one reason. It's also become an enormous industry. The production and marketing of tests, the training of people to administer and score the tests, the equipment. I wonder if we have hanging chads on these tests. And the equipment has become, and the mechanism of tests itself is a huge profit-making industry. But so is everything to do with schools. So that's not really it. Also, I think it seems to people on the surface as the most fair way of judging. Because if every kid takes the same test, theoretically, it's a relatively unbiased instrument. I don't happen to believe it is, but and a lot of the stuff that it attempts to measure isn't necessarily in any correspondence to what kids have been taught in the classroom. Or it uses words to measure vocabulary that the average kid doesn't encounter. It contains a lot of cultural bias. But it also indicates something about literacy, because even a very culturally biased test, if you can't read it, you can't read it. So the schools that typically score the lowest on standardized reading tests in Chicago tend to correlate with schools where poverty is the highest, and where not necessarily is English spoken in the home, or certainly not standard English in the home. And this is true throughout the country, in urban centers and in impoverished rural communities as well. People saw it, I think, including people at the policy level, saw it as the reason they call it standardized, obviously, is it's some standard that you would use to measure kid against kid and school against school. And that there would be a way of holding school systems and administrators and teachers responsible for the productivity of their work, for the educational dollars that are invested. And that you should get bang for the buck. If we spend X million dollars on your school district, X number of kids should be able to read at grade level. And if they can't, there's a blame game that goes on about that. And it's a problem. And we, of course, all noticed it in the last presidential campaign, that between Gore and Bush, they were really trying to outdo each other on who was stronger and more forceful on accountability of local school districts, who was really going to put people's feet to the fire and make them teach those kids more effectively. It's not a matter, I think, so much of public will as it is of knowing how to do what needs doing. For example, what we do in Chicago, a lot of what we do is work to break down schools, reorganize them, do the profound organizational changes that enable us to actually know kids, have long-term relationships between kids and adults who teach them, so that they can address their learning needs over time.
What are some of those things?
Well, if you have kids for one semester and you pass them on to the next teacher, you can't really say you've gotten to know them well. If a kid's in trouble, you can't really intervene. You haven't hardly learned their name till February, and then they're gone. In some of our high schools, teachers teach up to 5 or 6 divisions of 30 kids each per day. That means you have 150 to 180 kids passing in front of you on a daily basis. Say you're an English teacher. Say you give one writing assignment a week. That means you would have to give some kind of meaningful feedback to 180 papers a week. Can you really expect change to take place in the quality of kids' writing if that's the relationship that they have? As a writer, you know that it takes time and repetition and persistence and a trusting relationship with a person to be able to improve. That's just one. But multiply that by the math teacher, the science teacher, who may have a kid who can't read at level and therefore can't read the textbook, and so forth. Then couple that with cutbacks on the so-called soft subjects such as sports, phys ed, or the arts, the stuff that's most engaging and expressive for kids, and you have very little compelling reason for kids to show up for school. And this is not just a Chicago problem. What's changed in Chicago that I think is really significant since 1995 is that the Chicago Board of Education and Mayor Daley took a position that, yes, it makes sense. The research that we've shown them makes sense that schools are too big. They need to get smaller, and they need to forge strong long-term relationships between small teams of adults and kids.
So if you acknowledge those as what needs to happen in terms of building up these schools, say, as Mayor Daley bought into that idea in the last definitely.
I think so. And he was pro-voucher when he first became mayor. He was in favor of sort of farming kids out to the archdiocesan schools and to other independent schools and using public dollars. If the public schools in Chicago were failing, then let's get those kids out of them and take those same dollars and educate them somewhere else. And I think as he came to know the problem and see that, look, we're talking about 450,000 kids. It's not so simple. There aren't enough private classrooms in Chicago that you could even do that if it were right to do. But plus, he said, this makes sense. Small schools are what rich people have always had for their kids. The independent schools like Andover and Lake Forest Academy, they don't have 30 kids in a class, and they don't have 1,200 kids in an elementary school. They wouldn't dream of it. Why shouldn't our kids have the advantages of the small school? So they made it policy here, and in the last 9 years, we have established over 300 small public schools, many of them within large schools in the Chicago public system. That's major. We have done more about that than any other major city in the United States to address the issue of school size. And we have a long way to go, but we've done more than any other city to address that issue.
Can you explain how that works? You said to establish small schools and or smaller schools within larger ones?
Yes, because there's a lot of ways to configure schools. We have to change the way we look at schools. It's not just the brick and mortar of a building. You could have a school like Lane Tech, which was originally built for 3,500 kids and currently, I believe, has a student body of 4,000. And you could say, look, this doesn't make sense. Kids are getting lost in the shuffle here. Instead, let's take that same building and break it down into 5 or 6 schools, each led by a team of teachers, each one with its own curricular focus, its own student body, its own faculty, and they have certain, for cost efficiency purposes, certain common areas. The lunchroom, you're only going to have one swimming pool, you may only have one library, but the schools themselves each have their own identity. The kids who are most interested in performing arts or who want to be filmmakers, they're in that fine arts school at Lane. The kids who are interested in engineering, they're in a different one. All of them are.
When you talk about breaking up those schools into individual focuses like the arts and technology and science-based or anything, why is that cut? I mean, how is a high school student supposed to? I mean, some students might know that they're interested in the arts. Some of them might be better athletes. But my 2 questions are: one, high school students don't know what they want their career to be, even if they have some sense of what interests them and what they do that. And the other is, what is to prevent 6 individual schools within one school from having one school that's better than the other 5, and that has
these
higher
are great
test
questions,
or higher rate of achievement.
Are we just creating elite schools for some kids?
The same structure you're trying to.
That's a really important question. Right now, when my kid starts high school, she has no choices. There's a core curriculum every kid has to take: an English, a math, a social studies, a this, or that, and an elective.
Does she have a choice which high school she would go to in the city?
If she were in Chicago, yes, she would have some choices. She would have the magnet options. She would apply to the select enrollment schools for the for the cream of the crop, and hopefully she would get into one of them. Yeah, and that my other kids went to Whitney Young, and that is the cream of the crop, the academic elite of Chicago. This is the school for the most academically successful kids, no question. Although we now have some more of those. But what I'm concerned about is people worry, oh, you're going to give kids choices. Well, yeah. Well, yeah. If you don't want a choice, go to a conventional school. But if you want a choice, if that might keep you from dropping out, for example, or being bored, senseless, yes. Moreover, none of these, whether it's a school that focuses on the transportation industry and auto mechanics, or a school that focuses on pre-law and accounting, none of them should preclude college. All of them should assume we're going to college, we're all taking the SAT, we're all taking the ACT. We're also going to have this trade focus or this field focus or whatever, life sciences or performing arts. This is a means for improving student engagement. It doesn't, and I think you're raising a good question. We don't want kids to close off some options. It is too soon to know. It's not like declaring a major in college. You're 14, 15 years old. You don't have to choose your life path. Although some kids really know from a very early age what they want to do. Most kids, that's not the case. And we don't want to shunt some kids off into vocational tracks and others into college-bound tracks and reinforce the kinds of tracking that have always plagued secondary schools. And at the same time, you see, right now, there's no choice for most kids. You just go where you go. You take what you take. If you don't like it, you drop out. So we want to find ways. But that's not even the main reason. Columbine had 1,900 kids. How could Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado, 2 years ago, where this mass murder took place by a group of kids, by 2 kids, the principal could look at the media, at the TV cameras the next day and say, I never heard of any such thing as the trench coat mafia. And yet all these kids were saying, we told you. We came to you. We complained about them. We were afraid of them. We alerted you. They were doing racial harassment. They have all this Nazi stuff on their website. How come we all knew and you didn't know? The problem is we don't know our kids. If we have these huge institutions, there's stuff going on. We have no idea. Our only hope, there's 2 paths right now. Our only hope, one is to put video cameras everywhere, metal detectors, frisk everybody every day, create a highly militarized atmosphere in the schools, lots of cops. And the other way is to try and forge community in our schools as well as in our neighborhoods and build a strong support system for kids and break the big institutions down so that we know each other. So that if there's a kid wandering around that you've never seen before, you as an adult can say, hey, buddy, where do you belong? Every kid should have a home within a school where that's where they belong, that we know where they belong, and that somebody notices when they're not there. And doesn't go, oh, that's a relief, he's not here today, but calls his house and says, we're waiting for you. That doesn't happen now in most cases because we're too overworked, too overcrowded. And the kids who don't show up may be the disruptive kid who you're happy when they don't show up.
So I have 2 questions for you. The first is, how do you make that work? If you face the same numbers of people, available teachers in the state, resources in terms of what's in the budget, space in schools already owned by the city, how do you create what it is you're talking about? And the other is, how do you take that model and create what it is you're talking about for communities in general? I always hear and feel, whatever, Chicago is a city of neighborhoods in a way that other cities in this country are not. So how do you take that model for creating schools that are small or have schools within a school and transfer it in terms of creating the communities that you're talking about throughout the city, both including and outside of the school? Well,
it's a really good question. And one of the ways that we're approaching it in Chicago is that community-based organizations are offering to partner with the Chicago Public Schools and operate schools themselves as part of the Chicago system. So, for example, the Chicago Commons Association, which is, I think, the largest and certainly one of the oldest multi-service agencies in the city. It runs daycare and domestic counseling and drug rehabilitation and job training, all these different programs. It's one of these huge, started as a settlement house 100 years ago, huge agency, operates the Future Commons High School on the south side that has a teacher preparation academy for high school kids who know they want to go into teaching as a vocation. Future Commons is a small high school. I think it's under 300 kids, and where they get their social service support and their job training support is from this agency that actually knows how to do that stuff. So the school guidance counselor isn't out there alone. They have the backup of an agency that's looking to redevelop a community. Likewise, Acorn, a community organization in the West Side and Little Village, operates the Acorn Charter High School in partnership with Chicago Public Schools and with local organizers in that community and parents who wanted an alternate high school choice for their kids. Not for kids who were dropouts, not for kids who already were in trouble in the juvenile justice system, but just an alternative to the big, impersonal, and ineffective high school in that community. And where they said, this is a way to start. So that's one thing. How do you make it work? I think it's really important that people understand that there's no such thing as efficiencies of scale, in the sense that if you make a bigger school, it's cheaper to operate. It isn't cheaper. It's more expensive. You need more security personnel. You need more everything. But
why would you need more? If you say you have a high
because
school
if
with
you're
1,000 students, as opposed to 4 high schools within that high school that have 250 students.
Why do you need more?
No, I'm saying how do you use the same resources to achieve the different objectives? How do you
you still got the same number of kids. Good. You still have the same number of kids, but the adults who know those kids. If I'm with 5 other teachers and I'm only responsible for 200 kids or 150 kids, I'm gonna have 10 or 15 of them that every day those are my kids. I don't need a guidance counselor. I'm responsible for those 15 for 3 years. If I can't teach 15 kids to read in 3 years, what am I? I mean, the thing is, you're taking personal responsibility for a group of kids over time. At the end of the semester, they're not gone. You're not rid of them. They're not rid of you. You have to work it out because you're going to work together for 3 years.
More, not 4.
Well, generally, the way we've been doing this in Chicago is that in the freshman year, people enter a high school and they have a general studies year. A lot of it is sort of an entry-level year where they explore their options. Personally, I think 4 would be better, but this is how we're doing it right now. It's because this is still highly experimental and being phased in. But some of our best high school, I want to mention one other thing. One of our best new small high schools in Chicago is called Best Practices at 2040 West Adams. And it's operated in partnership with the education faculty at National Louis University, which is the largest teacher training institution, in the region, I think. And it was the old Krieger Vocational High School, which was a complete failure of a high school. In 1995, they emptied out the high school, got rid of the staff. They went somewhere else. They rehabbed the building. And in 1996, it reopened with 2 small elementary schools and 1 small high school in a shared building. They share the gym, they share the cafeteria, they share the auditorium. They have 1 principal and 1 principal's salary. And each of these small schools has its own faculty, its own student body, and each one has a lead teacher or a team that has developed out of its own ranks. And the Best Practices high school kids are there from the 9th grade through the 12th grade. They're there for 4 years. 2 of our newest small high schools in Chicago are grades 6 to 12. We take kids in the 6th grade, and they stay all the way through the 12th grade, thereby eliminating the transition between elementary school and high school. It's a lot smoother. Kids are bigger anyway, so middle school and high school have been put together as a 6 to 12 school. And the older kids mentor the younger kids and keep them in and help them to achieve academically. And I think in these kinds of settings where teachers have a little more autonomy, they can try stuff. that in a big school would be absolutely difficult to organize, because when you have a huge institution like Taft or Chicago Vocational with 2,300 kids, if some teachers get to do something and other teachers don't get to do it, it becomes an excuse and a source of resentment for low performance. So it's really important that a whole school decide to make this kind of a change at the same time. It requires a lot of discussion first.
What's the bottom line? I mean, what you're proposing, it all sounds great. You guys seem to be making it happen in some places, and at the same time, they're giant ideas about changing the entire approach to public education, right?
Yep.
So what are both the biggest obstacles, and what's the reality of what you're finding in terms of, okay, when you make these changes, do you also find that test scores change to serve the needs that some of these people feel, you have to have these quantifiable results? And at the same time, if you're trying to get away from that being the bottom line of how you measure progress and achievement in the first place, how do you restructure our entire nation's way of perceiving education, and why is the argument such that it is right now between vouchers and standardized test scores and all this kind of stuff? And I'm still not clear on what you're saying about how you allocate. You're still dealing with a shortage of tens of thousands of teachers in the state. You're still dealing with buildings that are falling apart, or lack of funds for libraries and this kind of stuff. And you still have all the giant issues that you're talking about, that society, that students bring to school from their families and the community they live in. That obviously you're trying to address them and achieve them, but what's the larger picture about the feasibility of what you're talking about and what you guys have found is both working and not working?
It's a good, you asked you're asking me to forecast the entire outcome of what we're doing and not.
Please
I hope I won't look back in 10 years at this tape and go, oh my God, I can't believe I said that. How naive. But the great asset that we have in the city right now is that there's a body of experience, 10 years of site-based management of the schools, where people have the opportunity and the power to make decisions about running schools differently. Have the support of the mayor and city government, and a strong central administration of the school system that generally supports a push in this direction. That's two things that you really, really need. You can't really do this kind of change without some support up top. But where you really need it is from below, from the parents and the community organizers, the people in the neighborhoods saying, it's time to do something about this school or nobody will want to live here. And I think that's true throughout the country. In New York, they had a major philanthropic initiative called the New Visions Schools that set up 100 new small schools with private foundation funding over the last 5 years. Most of them neighborhood high schools and elementary schools, partnered with faith-based community organizations, museums, arts agencies. There's a lot of ways to do school besides the old ways we've done it. And I think the issue even of vouchers, some very good people, very civic-minded people have advocated such things as homeschooling or vouchers or whatever, simply because they've just become up to here with frustration at the inability to move a big city school system in a different direction. And we're saying, nope, you haven't given it your best shot yet. The best shot is empower the teachers. You won't have as many people burning out and leaving the system if they get the professional satisfaction of running a school the way they believe teaching is best done, and having relationships with the kids that they can maintain over time, and where they can really see and know in their gut that some real change has taken place, where kids are judged on the products and activities that they produce and the projects that they do, and not just on their test scores. So I think some thinking has to change, and that we've got a lot of the elements in place in Chicago, the partnerships, the public spirit for it. And the other thing that I think is very important is that the funding has to be in place to train people.
Is that a reallocation of the same funds?
In some sense it is, but President Clinton announced yesterday, December 28th, that by 2004 the national debt would be, and the projection is that there would be a surplus of $1.5 trillion, I believe. Now, the new Secretary of Defense, who was named yesterday by President-elect Bush is Donald Rumsfeld of Chicago, an advocate of spending billions to make this new missile defense system, Star Wars, which is a rehash of the Reagan defense plan from 15, 20 years ago. And now what we're going to see is money that could be redirected toward the rebuilding of our public education system for this new century, sucked back down into a futile and probably extremely dangerous nuclear weapons system at a time when every scientist is saying things have never been more precarious in terms of the danger of accidental nuclear conflagration. This country has choices to make that go way beyond the Chicago public schools, and that I think are terribly important in terms of what we tell our kids, what we value, what's worth spending $1 gazillion and mortgaging our future of our country on. But why people take education so seriously and get so heated up about the schools and want this more, at the local level, see this as the number one most important issue with crime being second, is because it's our kids. And sometimes you look at a failing school, it's like you're watching a train wreck in slow motion. And you can see it cannibalizing kids, and people feel very helpless to stop it. In Chicago, there's no longer that feeling of helplessness. We've had 10 years where people have been able to participate. And I'll tell you, looking back on it, I've seen many lives transformed. I've seen many parents who became active, were elected officials, publicly elected in an official election managed by the Chicago election commissioners, to become members of their local school councils, who then went back and got their degree or their high school diploma, and went back, and the more they learned about their kids' school, the more they wanted to go into education and change it, and who have become teachers. Directly as a result of this experience, I think participation, just as we thought in SDS, is a transformative force in society, and I think it still is in Chicago.
How does what's happening in the city now in terms of, whether it was a decade ago or 2 decades ago when people fled the city, white families fled, middle class people toured the suburbs, and that now in the past couple of years, and certainly in this year, we see so many people, middle class families, moving back into the city. How does the overall population and dynamics of the city impact the ability of the city to take what you're talking about and implement it, both in terms of in the public school system and in terms of building communities in general?
Well, it's been a big, huge issue in the last 5 years, that if you look at the areas where there's been a huge amount of in-city housing development, it's the South Loop from Dearborn Park on south, Burnham Park, and that whole area. And except for South Loop Elementary School, there are no schools for the kids of the middle class to attend. Well, when Mayor Jane Byrne was the mayor, and they were breaking ground for Dearborn Park, she made a speech in which she promised prospective home purchasers of this first big condominium development in the South Loop that she would provide them with an elementary school for their children if they would purchase units in Dearborn Park. And so South Loop Elementary School was built.
But what about beyond?
And wait. This is really important. The parents in the Hilliard Homes Chicago Housing Project said, "Whoa, we've been trying to get our kids out of those trailers and into a new school for 30 years. And these folks come in here and they get a new school. Well, our kids are going to come here." Well, the new pioneers in the South Loop go, "Well, wait a minute, I didn't buy a condo here in order for my kid to go to school with project kids." A lot of this stuff is not really about housing and neighborhoods. It's about race, and it's about the relationships between people. And the schools can go very far in addressing that by building new schools, creating new choices, and offering new options. But they can't do it all. The schools can't do it all. I think it has probably had more to do with new school construction, such as the new Walter Payton High School on the north side, than any other factor, is that you couldn't sell this real estate development if you didn't have a place for people to send their kids.
So what about the crux of that argument you just made?
I don't think it goes far. I don't think that schools alone can address those kinds of deep-lying social attitudes.
So that brings us to the overall ideas about where Chicago's at in the year 2000.
Chicago's in a better place than it was, and I think Harold Washington's election and leadership had a great deal to do with changing the way Chicago's feel about and experience race. But Harold's been gone since 1987, and I worry much less about where the people in these new yuppie developments will send their kids to school than where the people displaced from the Robert Taylor homes and the Henry Horner homes will have to send their kids to school.
Where will they?
It's not clear right now. It's not clear. I mean, many schools are threatened with closing right now because as the projects come down, like Robert Taylor, the populations of those elementary schools all along the State Street corridor are dropping. And as the populations drop, teacher positions have to be closed. As the population drops, DuSable High School, in the heart of the Robert Taylor homes, is threatened with closing. Well, then what happens to the people who still live in that community? So I would, if I were giving Mayor Daley advice, I'd say worry more about this, create more educational options for the poor, for the displaced, dispossessed people in the city. The yuppies have always been able to take care of themselves. And people, and make sure that when we create these new schools, that the Gold Coast doesn't get all the great amenities, wonderful new building, fully networked computer labs, and the scraps go to the poor communities. Make sure that it's equitable. And that we're still in the balance on that. I don't think the report card is in on how Chicago's doing on that rebuilding. Could go either way. And if history is any lesson, people should be very vigilant about it. I'd love to look back at this in 10 years and see how that turned out, because by then we'll know.
What are your other ideas about where Chicago's at this point in history? Well,
when I'll tell you, I didn't want to come back here in 1975 when we moved back here. I had no good memories of it. I had some bad experiences here with, as I related earlier, with police harassment and things like that. And we've had a really pretty good experience living here. I mean, because we've been part of the process of changing the public school system. We know a lot of people. The arts scene has grown magnificently. There's not that feeling anymore that Chicago is the city with a very low-level cultural life. The arts in neighborhoods have grown exponentially. I think it's a great place to raise kids, and I really wouldn't have said that in the mid-'70s. I didn't feel that way. I'm not sure what to attribute that to, but it's quite different.
Why did you choose to live in Oak Park instead of in the city?
It was completely accidental and personal. We came into a house that we weren't planning to live there, and we just do. And as soon as our youngest child graduates from high school, we'll be back in the city. So that's not really, it really is something that just happened. And that's, we had to move, we had to buy a house in a hurry, and something was offered to us, and so that's where we wound up.
Gotcha.
But I will say we're 2 blocks outside the city of Chicago. I can see Chicago from my front door, so I don't feel like I'm really that far away.
What would you like to see? Ideas about the city in general, whether it's about leadership, not necessarily only the mayor, but ideas about the way the city is run and the direction that the city goes in terms of addressing larger social issues you're talking about race and everything. Yeah. How that breaks down into transportation, development, and schools and environment, and all these ideas about what would you like to see.
I guess the biggest things to me, if I were gonna be in a position to make some things happen, is that I would like to see more incubator type structures put in place in communities like the Small Business Incubator and the Women's Business Development Center, where you actually have a physical space where adults can come together and think and learn and plan and redesign major chunks of civic life. I think the same way for arts studios and co-ops. I'd like to see them publicly supported. And we want to have a small schools incubator for Chicago, a design center where teams of teachers and parents actually get office space, technical assistance, architectural and financial help on planning and creating the new schools that we're going to need in the city over the next 20 to 30 years. I got a long list of other stuff too, but that's
beyond
that's the big
incubators,
stuff.
ideas about
Beyond. I'd like every part of the city to have a lot more arts access than we have now. We have parts of the city where there are no bookstores, where there are no theaters. I think that's a terribly important thing. I'd like to see more community museums, and there's some quite wonderful ones that have been done on a shoestring with almost no public support. That I'd like to see that change significantly. And I'd like to see a big movement toward co-housing in the city, so that as the population ages, there's more options for people than the CHA senior housing. I'd like to see people being able to take buildings and run them cooperatively without having to have a huge amount of money in order to live decently. And be able to stay in their neighborhoods and be taken care of by a community without having to move somewhere far away to keep a roof over their head. And I think co-housing is probably the way to go in cities in the future. I have a lot of Jetsons type fantasies about light rail lines and people not having to drive cars and stuff like that I think, if I were the mayor, everybody would have a way to get to a train,
So how do you balance the forces of capitalism and the desire to make a more viable community, even if that community is a couple million people?
It's tricky. I mean, I think the city of neighborhoods is the concept that's terribly important. And now that the neighborhoods are no longer quite as racially isolated or quite as segregated as they once were, although some of them are, a lot of them are, we have some real possibilities but it requires leadership. It requires imagination. That's what I like about your project. It brings people together to see what each other look like and what their neighborhoods look like right now. Not all that different in some respects, If you look at Chicago 10 years from now, I mean, one thing that I imagine we will see is much more like New York, like Soho, Tribeca, or Prospect Heights, much more racially and culturally mixed neighborhoods.
You think that is the direction?
I do think, but I think it's very market driven. I think it's because a lot of desirable real estate, for example, is in the South Shore area and in the area where the Robert Taylor homes were, where Stateway Gardens are and stuff like that, and that real estate developers are just waiting to get that stuff, get their hands on that land and turn it into something different. The question is what's going to happen to the people in poverty who live there now. And that, I think, is a real concern. Chicago still hasn't ever since the steel industry left here in the mid-70s, there isn't really a big new source of jobs here. We're not Silicon Valley. We don't have, we have a big health industry, but we don't have much of a new, where are the 28,000 people going to go who lost their jobs at Ward's? Or the tens of thousands who lost their jobs in basic steel? I have no idea, but I think that's really the critical question for leaders right now, is to create some sources of employment that are not going to ruin the environment, but that can improve the economy. And I think a lot of it's going to have to do with rebuilding the city. Building new kinds of transportation and building new kinds of housing. I'm a lot of ideas.
Can you tell me your name again and where we are?
I can't remember. My name is Susan Klonsky. We are sitting in the Small Schools Workshop at the UIC College of Education, 115 South Sangamon Street, formerly the Illinois Eye and Ear Infirmary. And before that, this building was the Illinois Tuberculosis Institute since 1920-something. How's that?
Thank you, Susan.